Please be seated. The sitting is open. For reasons duly made known to me, Judge Bandari will not sit with us in these oral proceedings. The court meets today under Article 74, Paragraph 3 of the Rules of Court to hear the oral observations of the parties on the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by the Republic of Azerbaijan in the case concerning application of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Azerbaijan versus Armenia. This morning, the Republic of Azerbaijan will present its single round of oral argument. In line with the approach adopted by the court in respect of its public sittings, the present hearings will take place in person. However, taking into account the current public health situation in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, a limited number of seats have been made available for members of the diplomatic corps and guests, as well as for members of the public. In addition, all those present in the Great Hall of Justice will be required to wear face masks at all times, except when taking the floor. I shall now recall the principal steps of procedure in the present case. On 23 September 2021, Azerbaijan filed in the registry of the court an application instituting proceedings against Armenia concerning alleged violations of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. I shall refer to this convention as CERD. To found the jurisdiction of the court, Azerbaijan invokes Article 36, Paragraph 1 of the Statute of the Court and Article 22 of CERD. Together with its application, Azerbaijan also submitted a request for the indication of provisional measures referring to Article 41 of the statute and to Articles 73, 74, and 75 of the Rules of Court. By an order of 7 December 2021, the court, having heard the parties, indicated the following provisional measures. I quote, 1. The Republic of Armenia shall, in accordance with its obligations under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, take all necessary measures to prevent the incitement and promotion of racial hatred, including by organizations and private persons in its territory, targeted at persons of Azerbaijani national or ethnic origin. And 2, both parties shall refrain from any action which might aggravate or extend the dispute before the court or make it more difficult to resolve. End of quote. By an order dated 21 January 2022, the court fixed 23 January 2023 and 23 January 2024 as the respective time limits for the filing of a memorial by Azerbaijan and a counter-memorial by Armenia. On 4 January 2023, Azerbaijan submitted a new request for the indication of provisional measures, referring to Article 41 of the statute and to Articles 73, 74, and 75 of the Rules of Court. In its request, Azerbaijan states that, I quote, new evidence has emerged that Armenia, contradicting representations it made to the court in 2021, deliberately continued to lay landmines in or after 2021 in civilian zones to which displaced Azerbaijanis are slated to return. End of quote. It adds that, I quote, in October 2022, Azerbaijan also discovered booby traps in civilian homes that were planted or facilitated by Armenia's forces. End of quote. According to Azerbaijan, I quote, to date, Armenia has refused to share information in its possession about the location of landmines and booby traps laid in areas over which Azerbaijan has recently regained control. End of quote. Referring to CERD, Azerbaijan contends that Armenia's conduct is discriminatory both in purpose and effect, and that the ongoing and serious threat of further irreparable harm to certain rights enshrined in CERD render its request urgent. The registrar will now read out the passage from the request specifying the provisional measures which the government of Azerbaijan is asking the court to indicate. You have the floor, Mr. Registrar.
Thank you, Madam President. I quote, Azerbaijan, in its own right and as parents patriae of its citizens, respectfully requests the court as a matter of urgency to indicate the following provisional measures which are directly linked to the rights that form the subject matter of this dispute, pending its determination of this case on the merits. A. Armenia shall immediately take all necessary steps to enable Azerbaijan to undertake the prompt, safe and effective demining of the towns, villages and other areas to which Azerbaijani civilians will return in the Lachin district, Kalbajar district, and other formerly occupied districts of Azerbaijan, including by providing information about the location, quantity, type, and characteristics of landmines, booby traps, and any other explosive devices in these areas in order to enable Azerbaijani internally displaced persons to return to their homes, and B, Armenia shall immediately cease and desist from any further efforts to plant or to sponsor or support the planting of landmines and booby traps in these areas to which Azerbaijani civilians will return in Azerbaijan's territory, including but not limited to the use of the Lachin corridor for this purpose. End of quote. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Registrar. Immediately after the request for the indication of provisional measures of 4 January 2023 was filed, the Deputy Registrar transmitted a certified copy thereof to the Government of Armenia. He also notified the Secretary General of the United Nations. According to Article 74, Paragraph 1 of the Rules of Court, a request for the indication of provisional measures shall have priority over all other cases. Paragraph 2 of the same article states that the Court shall proceed to a decision on the request as a matter of urgency. This imperative must, however, be balanced with the need to fix the date of the oral proceedings in such a way as to afford the parties an opportunity to be represented at the hearings. Consequently, the parties were informed that the oral proceedings, during which they could present their observations on the request for the indication of provisional measures, would be held on Tuesday, 31 January 2023, starting at 10 a.m. I would now like to welcome the delegations of the parties. I note the presence of the two agents, accompanied by members of their respective states' delegation. This morning, the Court will hear Azerbaijan, which has submitted the request for the indication of provisional measures. It will hear Armenia this afternoon at 4 p.m. For purposes of this single round of oral argument, each of the parties will have available to it a 2-hour sitting. In this first sitting, Azerbaijan may, if required, avail itself of a short extension beyond 12 noon today, in view of the time taken up by these introductory remarks. Before I give the floor to the agent of Azerbaijan, I wish to draw attention of the parties to Practice Direction 11, which states as follows, I quote, "In the oral proceedings on requests for the indication of provisional measures, parties should limit themselves to what is relevant to the criteria for the indication of provisional measures as stipulated in the statute, rules, and jurisprudence of the Court. They should not enter into the merits of the case beyond what is strictly necessary for that purpose." I now give the floor to the agent of Azerbaijan, His Excellency, Mr. Elnur Mammadov. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, honorable members of the Court, it is a privilege to appear before you again on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan appeals to the Court today for one reason, and one reason only: to stop the continued murder and maiming of Azerbaijanis on the basis of their ethnic and national origin by explosive devices recently planted by the Republic of Armenia after the signing of the trilateral statement in November 2020. Just over a year ago, Armenia told the Court that, and I quote, "It is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan," end quote. This was false. Azerbaijan has uncovered new facts regarding Armenia's ongoing planting of landmines and other explosive devices that warrant this fresh request for provisional measures. Since the Court's 7th December 2021 order, Azerbaijan has discovered over 2,700 new landmines manufactured in Armenia in 2021, laid in Azerbaijani's territory, including over 1,600 mines planted in or near civilian areas far from the Azerbaijani-Armenian border, to which displaced Azerbaijanis are returning. Azerbaijan also found booby traps hidden in houses belonging to Azerbaijanis prior to Armenia's occupation and built with tripwires to kill or maim any Azerbaijanis returning home. These explosive devices pose an urgent threat of death and serious injury to Azerbaijanis. I note at the outset that I and Azerbaijan's legal counsel that follow will refer to Azerbaijanis as an ethnic origin or national origin group, and not in relation to nationality or citizenship. First, this threat is real. Since 10 November 2020, when a trilateral statement signed by Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Russian Federation agreeing to the cessation of hostilities came into effect, 282 Azerbaijanis have been either injured or killed by explosive devices planted in or around the territories that Azerbaijan liberated from Armenia's occupation. This includes 33 civilians who have been killed and a further 86 civilians injured by landmines. Among the victims are Azerbaijanis violently expelled by Armenia 30 years ago seeking to return home, as well as Azerbaijani workers engaged in demining and rebuilding the territories devastated by Armenia's occupation. The victims are women and men, young and old, from an 11-year-old boy tending cattle to a 64-year man visiting a family member's grave. The trait that these now hundreds of victims share is that they are all of Azerbaijani ethnic and or national origin. In your folder at tab 4 are the photographs and information of these victims from 10 November 2020 to 14 December 2022. Second, this threat is ongoing. 45 of these Azerbaijani civilian casualties occurred after the court's 7 December 2021 provisional measures order. And the casualty count only continues to rise. As recently as this past December, 7 Azerbaijanis were injured and 1 killed as a result of landmine blasts in Chirag village in the formerly occupied Kelbejar district. This village sits 25 kilometers away from the Azerbaijan-Armenia border, and no defensive lines passed through the village during either the First or Second Karabakh Wars. 4 of the Azerbaijanis injured by the blast were civilian employees of a telecommunications company. They were engaged in vital reconstruction work that must be completed before the over 700,000 Azerbaijanis internally displaced by Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing can return home. If Azerbaijanis preparing the liberated territories for the return of those displaced cannot do so safely, how can displaced Azerbaijanis safely exercise their right to return? The purpose and effect of Armenia's conduct are clear. Azerbaijanis are not meant to. The crux of the matter is this. Azerbaijanis are continuing to suffer serious injury and die because Armenia refuses to share the information that could save them. As the court is aware, international organizations and foreign states have expressed grave concerns about the rising death toll from landmines in the liberated territories and the obstacle this poses to IDP return. Azerbaijan has raised this issue in every conceivable forum to no avail. First, raising it in August 2022 with the Russian peacekeeping forces, shortly after the initial set of 2021 mines was discovered. And then with the United Nations Secretary General on 24 August 2022. And then through bilateral correspondence with Armenia on 15 September 2022. and receiving no response in correspondence before the court on 22 September 2022. Before the United Nations Secretary General again in November and December 2022, and most recently with the Russian Federation on 23 December 2022. But Armenia has repeatedly and categorically refused to engage on the issue. And as you heard yesterday, pull out of what were supposed to be trilateral negotiations on 23 December with no prior notice or justifiable excuse. With no other recourse, Azerbaijan now turns to the court seeking provisional measures to prevent further irreparable harm to the rights of Azerbaijanis undisturbed. Armenia's planting of landmines and booby traps in or near areas where Azerbaijanis once lived and are expected to return, specifically to terrorize Azerbaijanis, must be understood in the broad context of its over 3-decade-long campaign of ethnic cleansing and anti-Azerbaijani incitement. During this time, Armenia invaded and occupied a significant part of Azerbaijan's territory in order to create a unified, mono-ethnic Armenian state. In that pursuit, any trace of the existence of Azerbaijanis was systematically erased from Armenia and the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan. All of this for one reason. These people, these buildings, this cultural site, this land were Azerbaijani, and therefore their coexistence alongside Armenians was, in the words of Armenian government officials, and I quote, impossible, not compatible, a tragedy in itself, end quote. When Azerbaijan liberated its territories from occupation after the Second Karabakh War, Armenia agreed, under the trilateral statement, to a number of binding commitments, including one, and I quote, a complete ceasefire and termination of all hostilities, end quote. Two, the return of the Aghdam, Kalbajar, and Lachin districts to Azerbaijan. Three, withdrawal of Armenia's forces from Azerbaijan's territory alongside the deployment of the Russian peacekeepers. And four, the return of displaced persons to the liberated territories. As discussed yesterday, the trilateral statement also provided for a new road through the Lachin district, within the 5-kilometer wide Lachin corridor that would remain under the control of the Russian peacekeeping forces, to connect Armenia to Khankendi and their surrounding areas where the Russian peacekeepers are temporarily deployed. The new road was to bypass towns formerly populated by Azerbaijanis, to allow displaced Azerbaijanis to begin their return to those areas. This new Lachin road was completed in August 2022, and Azerbaijan regained control of the town of Lachin and the villages of Zabukh and Sus at that time. Since Azerbaijan regained control of these areas and began demining and reconstruction work in preparation for welcoming displaced Azerbaijanis home, it has discovered newly constructed booby traps and newly laid Armenian-made landmines planted in or near Azerbaijani villages. In October 2022, in the villages of Zabukh and Sus, Azerbaijan discovered explosive booby traps carefully hidden in civilian structures and set with military precision. Madam President, honorable members of the court, you have in your folders excerpts from a report submitted by Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency, known as ANAMA, which contains detailed information about these booby traps. As the ANAMA report demonstrates, and as Azerbaijan's distinguished counsel will further explain, these traps were set in the very homes and other structures that had belonged to the Azerbaijanis violently expelled from these villages in the early 1990s. In addition, since August 2022, Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense, which is conducting mine clearance operations in the Lachin and Kalbajar districts, has discovered over 2,700 new landmines in those districts that were manufactured in Armenia in 2021. More than half of those landmines were found near villages that had been returned to Azerbaijan under the trilateral statement in 2020, which were formerly inhabited only by Azerbaijanis and to which Azerbaijanis are due to return. and the mines were necessarily transported to these areas, which are far from the Azerbaijan-Armenian border, via what should be the exclusively humanitarian Lachen corridor, as that is the only route from Armenia to these areas of Azerbaijan. Since Azerbaijan began raising the issue of the new mines and traps last August, Armenia has responded only with blanket denials, including in correspondence before the court on 27 September 2022. But more recently, including last week through its foreign minister and in Armenia's Annex 1 submitted to the court, Armenia has come forward with the allegation that these Armenian-made landmines actually were taken by Azerbaijan from Armenia in 2021, 2022, and then somehow transported to the interior of Azerbaijan, where they were found in order to display them, and I quote, for propaganda purposes, end quote. To start, Azerbaijan has never occupied Armenia's territory. The clashes Armenia appears to be referring to occurred along the non-demarcated Azerbaijan-Armenia border, not in Armenia, and were provoked by Armenia's military, as documented via contemporaneous releases from Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense. More fundamentally, Azerbaijan has never taken Armenia's landmines and transported them for propaganda purposes. This accusation is a blatant fabrication by Armenia, and it is no surprise that nowhere in any public statements or the annexes does Armenia point to any evidence in support of it. Let me assure the court that Azerbaijan is not putting its people's lives at risk to take thousands of highly dangerous anti-personnel mines and move them into Azerbaijan. This is absurd. Another fiction that Armenia seems to be propounding in its annexes, which you may hear this afternoon, is that these new mines were laid along a new, and I quote, line of contact, end quote, between Azerbaijan's forces and the self-styled, and I quote, Nagorno-Karabakh Defense Army, end quote. But there is no such entity separate and apart from the armed forces of Armenia. These are simply the military forces of Armenia's illegally installed regime in Karabakh, which Azerbaijan will refer to as the installed regime. There is also no new line of contact contemplated by the trilateral statement, quite the opposite. The prior line of contact separated Armenia's forces in the then occupied territories from the rest of Azerbaijan. But the trilateral statement mandated, and I quote, the withdrawal of the Armenian troops, end quote, concurrently with the deployment of the Russian peacekeeping forces. And that was the whole idea of the deployment of the Russian peacekeeping forces in the area. The reference to, quote, contact line, end quote, in paragraph 3, as the court can see on the slide, is only to define the area where the peacekeepers would deploy. There is thus no world under the trilateral statement where Azerbaijan's forces and Armenia's forces could now be facing each other across a new line of contact, located within the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan, as asserted by Armenia in its Annex 1. This is a deliberate misrepresentation of the trilateral statement, conjured by Armenia to cobble together some kind of justification for landmines not on the international border, but within Azerbaijan's territory. To close, in October 2021, we informed the court that absent urgent intervention, it would take up to a decade to complete clearance operations sufficiently to allow the majority of displaced Azerbaijanis to return home. Now, based on Armenia's ongoing contact and the discovery of thousands of new mines and explosive devices, updated estimates place this number at closer to 30 years. And all the while, the number of Azerbaijani deaths and injuries from Armenia's explosive devices continues to tick higher and higher. Azerbaijan urgently needs the requested measures in order to protect against these ongoing violations of CERT. Madam President, honorable members of the court, Azerbaijan's distinguished counsel will now address our request for provisional measures to explain why an order indicating each measure is warranted and urgently needed. First, Mr. Van Loo will discuss the framework of Azerbaijan's provisional measures request. Second, Ms. Catherine Amirfar will explain the new evidence underpinning Azerbaijan's request and why Azerbaijan's claims concern plausible rights on the third, because Armenia's actions have the effect of discriminating against Azerbaijanis. Third, Ms. Natalie Reid will explain why Azerbaijan's claims concern plausible rights on the third, for the additional reason that Armenia's actions have the purpose of discriminating against Azerbaijanis. Fourth, Professor Laurence Bosson de Chazoun will address the link between the requested measures and the rights Azerbaijan seeks to protect on the third, as well as further explain the urgency of Azerbaijan's request. And finally, I will return to close with Azerbaijan's submissions. Thank you, Madam President, honorable members of the court, for the privilege of appearing before you. I now kindly ask you, Madam President, to invite Ms. Van Loo to address the court.
I thank the agent of Azerbaijan for his statement, and I now invite Mr. Van Loo to take the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, members of the court, my task this morning is to describe the framework of Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures and, incidentally, to explain the differences from Armenia's request. Those differences are important to Azerbaijan, not only because they distinguish sharply between the respective merits of the two requests, but also because Azerbaijan wishes to put to rest any thought that its request is a tit-for-tat reaction to Armenia's request. It's not. Azerbaijan's request concerns the danger posed by landmines and booby traps that were recently planted by or under the eyes of Armenian forces in particular areas of Azerbaijan where internally displaced Azerbaijanis are known to be returning to their homes, pursuant to the agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This slide shows such a device wired to explode when anyone opens the door to go into the house. This was found in an area formerly occupied by Armenia, from which the Azerbaijani population had been displaced. There are no Armenian soldiers in the Azerbaijani house defending themselves with the device. There's no apparent reason for supposing that the first person to open the door will be an Azerbaijani soldier. The device could be triggered by a returning house owner or a builder sent in to repair the damage to the house, or by a child. And the same is true of the landmines hidden in the ground. These devices are intended to kill people who trigger them accidentally, and that is what they're doing. So far, 282 people have been injured or killed since the signing of the trilateral statement in November 2020. If one person were killed, we'd call it murder. But there are literally thousands of these devices planted in Azerbaijani areas with the intention of maiming or killing those who stumble across them. These latest Armenian devices cannot be brushed aside as unfortunate remnants of the hostilities. As Ms. Amirfar will explain, these landmines were certainly planted during or after 2021. That is, after the agreed ceasefire imposed by the trilateral statement of November 2020. And they were planted in and around specifically Azerbaijani civilian communities in areas previously controlled by Armenia, but from which regular Armenian troops have now been withdrawn. New minefields are still being discovered, most recently last November. These hidden devices are killing innocent civilians. And the deaths and the maimings can be stopped, or at least greatly reduced, by Armenia telling us where they are hidden. And there's one simple question for Armenia to answer this afternoon. Why won't you tell us where these hidden devices are and save lives? What is Armenia's reason for letting the deaths and the maimings continue? The continuing danger posed by the landmines and booby traps is a matter that Azerbaijan has tried hard to resolve in negotiations. It's a matter that could and should have been resolved before now in talks between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But as you've heard, last month, on the 23rd of December, Armenia failed to attend the scheduled talks that had been arranged in Moscow without giving any warning or explanation to Russia or to Azerbaijan. And it became apparent that there is no realistic possibility of negotiations producing a solution. So, on January the 4th, 2023, Azerbaijan filed its request. There is new evidence of new mines and in a new situation. And that is why this request was filed and why it was filed when it was filed and why it's urgent. One step, the handing over of information on the locations of these explosive devices, will save lives in the coming weeks and months. But for reasons that it will have the opportunity to explain to you this afternoon, Armenia will not take that step, and so Azerbaijan is seeking the assistance of the court. Its request is an appeal to the court to prevent yet more racially motivated deaths and maiming of Azerbaijanis before the merits of the case against Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing can be decided. If the court has any hesitation, we ask it to bear in mind two things. First, these devices can have no defensive purpose. They're not protecting any Armenian troops or any Armenian territory. And certainly the booby traps in the homes of Azerbaijanis who had been violently expelled can have no conceivable purpose which is defensive, no purpose whatsoever other than preventing them returning to their homes. Second, the devices are planted specifically in areas of Azerbaijan from which Azerbaijani residents were driven out by Armenia, and they have the specific effect of preventing those Azerbaijani citizens from returning to their homes. And it is the second point that engages rights and duties under the CERD. The court has recognised that the use of hidden explosives with the object or effect of driving persons of a certain national or ethnic origin from a particular area, as well as preventing their return thereto, can implicate rights under the Convention. Armenia should disclose the locations of these devices, and the court has long recognised this. It addressed the point in the very first case to come before it. As it said in its judgment in the Corfu Channel case, speaking of mines laid in Albanian territorial waters, the obligations incumbent upon the Albanian authorities consisted in notifying, for the benefit of shipping in general, the existence of a minefield in Albanian territorial waters, and in warning the approaching British warships of the imminent danger to which the minefield exposed them. Such obligations are based not on the Hague Convention of 1907, number 8, which is applicable in time of war, but on certain general and well-recognized principles, namely elementary considerations of humanity, even more exacting in peace than in war. And similarly, the court in the military and paramilitary activities case held that the United States had breached its obligations under customary international law by, quote, failing to make known the existence, location of the mines laid by it, end quote, to Nicaragua. So it is upon the third and those elementary considerations of humanity, even more exacting in peace than in war, that Azerbaijan bases the present request. As my colleague Ms. Reid will show, and Armenia has not denied, the markings on the landmines indicate that they were manufactured in Armenia by an Armenian company, Heichmeg LLC, which made landmines for the Armenian government. The mines were transported from Armenia into Azerbaijan's territory, where Armenia has admitted that members of the armed forces of Armenia remained deployed as recently as September 2022. Armenia might try to argue that there is no proof that its forces actually laid the mines, but that is irrelevant. The mine laying, to use the court's words in Corfu Channel, surely could not have been accomplished without the knowledge of the Armenian forces. They must have been aware of the location of the minefields, not least to prevent the Armenian forces themselves from stumbling into them. More particularly, Third Article 2 prohibits sponsoring or supporting discriminatory acts. Armenia obviously continued to supply or to allow the supply of the mines regardless of who actually laid the minefields. So Armenia's argument that they were not the ones who actually wielded the spade and concealed the mines and the booby traps is factually doubtful and legally immaterial to their obligations under Third Article 2. The booby traps, as distinct from the mines, were constructed from hand grenades and other explosives. They used military materials, and their construction necessarily involved some prior knowledge of how those materials behave and operate. Whether those explosive traps were placed by Armenian soldiers or by departing Armenian civilian settlers, the people placing the devices must have obtained the equipment somewhere. Civilians don't keep hand grenades and explosives in their homes or buy them in local shops. And as Ms. Reid will explain, the way these particular booby traps are devised, packed with nails around explosives, makes clear not only the underlying military expertise in their manufacture, but also the intent to inflict as much physical injury as possible on Azerbaijanis attempting to access the homes and civilian structures in which they were found. Moreover, Armenia had control of the areas where these explosives were hidden up to and until August 2022. And in addition, it had under Third Article 2 the obligation actively to take steps to prevent discriminatory acts. Article 2 requires states not to sponsor, defend or support racial discrimination by any persons or organisations. Armenia was and is under an obligation to take action. And it's important to remember that for 3 decades Armenia illegally occupied and had control over this part of Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia exercised control by the extensive use of military force and indeed by refusing to withdraw its forces despite repeated demands from the international community, as well as by installing and controlling an illegal regime within Azerbaijan's territory. In 2015, the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights confirmed Armenia's effective control over significant parts of Azerbaijan's territory in its Shirogov decision. It held that Armenia and its installed regime were, quote, highly integrated in virtually all important matters, end quote, and that the installed regime was completely dependent upon Armenia, including in the military, law enforcement and local government sectors. The control exercised by Armenia over these areas continued after the Shirogov decision. Throughout the Second Karabakh War in 2020, Armenia controlled and directed all military forces operating in Karabakh. And in the aftermath, as the trilateral statement makes plain, Armenia remained in control of sizable parts of Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia then signed the 2020 trilateral statement, which required it to withdraw its forces and to hand over Lachin, Agdam and Kalbajar districts. Armenia controlled the handover of the towns and villages in the Lachin district where the booby traps were found. During this process, Armenian troops either directly participated in, or at the very least permitted and failed to prevent, the installation of booby traps and explosives, and actively participated in the destruction of property during their withdrawal. Determination of actual responsibility is, of course, a matter for the merit stage. It also needs to be remembered that Armenia was responsible for the illegal placement of settlers in these areas of the formerly occupied Azerbaijani territories in the first place. Armenia orchestrated their settlement and offered financial incentives and even citizenship to those who would stay. These settlers included Armenians from Syria and elsewhere whose desperation Armenia seized upon in placing them in the territories. Moreover, when the new Lachin Road was provided for in the trilateral statement and was completed, it was Armenia's installed regime which told the settlers to leave and when to do so. Armenia organised relocation of the settlers, and during the handover, the local village head directed the illegal settlers to turn to Pashinyan, the Armenian Prime Minister, with any complaints. The court has already ruled in its 7th December 2021 order that prima facie jurisdiction exists and that there are plausible links to plausible Surd rights. Urgency I've addressed above. It is literally a matter of acting now to save civilian lives. And it really is as simple as that. The mines and booby traps are having the effect of preventing Azerbaijanis from returning to their homes. Armenia knows where they are and ought to have stopped or prevented their deployment. And in any event, elementary considerations of humanity require it to pass on information on the location and characteristics of these explosives before more people are killed by them and before the breaches of the Surd are further compounded. That, in broad terms, is Azerbaijan's case. My colleagues will now address the request in more detail. Madam President, members of the Court, I thank you for your attention, and I'd ask that you now invite Ms. Catherine Amirfar to the lectern.
I thank Mr. Lowe, and I now invite Ms. Catherine Amirfar to address the Court. You have the floor.
Madam President, honorable members of the Court, it is a privilege to appear before you and an honor to have been entrusted with the presentation of this part of Azerbaijan's case. I will focus today on the plausibility of the rights invoked by Azerbaijan in its request, in accordance with the Court's settled jurisprudence regarding the indication of provisional measures. Specifically, Azerbaijan has plausibly shown that Armenia has violated CERD by planting booby traps and landmines in Azerbaijan's territory that have the effect and the purpose of targeting Azerbaijanis on the basis of ethnic or national origin. I start with the circumstances that have made it necessary for Azerbaijan to renew its request for provisional measures consistent with Article 75 of the Court's rules. As explained by the agent, Azerbaijan did not take returning to the Court lightly. Azerbaijan requests provisional measures at this time because of new urgency, in the face of recent deaths and injuries, and because of new facts demonstrating the racially discriminatory purpose and the racially discriminatory effect of Armenia's actions. In its order of 7 December 2021, addressing Azerbaijan's previous request for provisional measures, the Court recognized that, quote, a policy of driving persons of a certain national or ethnic origin from a particular area, as well as preventing their return thereto, can implicate rights under CERD, end quote. It furthermore recognized, quote, that such a policy can be effectuated through a variety of military means, end quote. But the Court found that the plausibility requirement had not been met at that time because of lack of evidence indicating that Armenia's alleged conduct impaired the equal enjoyment of the rights of Azerbaijanis on the basis of ethnic or national origin. The Court will recall that during the oral proceedings on that request, Armenia repeatedly argued that any landmines had been laid for defensive military purposes only. First and foremost, Armenia represented to the Court that, quote, Armenia is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, end quote. It also represented that any landmines had been laid, quote, for defensive purposes along the line of contact in the eastern and northern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, end quote, and therefore should be, quote, left in place given the military purpose that they served, end quote. Madam President, honorable members of the Court, new facts have come to light since the Court last addressed the issue of Armenia's conduct during the pendency of these proceedings. These facts make clear that Armenia's positions cannot be credited and that the indication of provisional measures is warranted. This is for three main reasons that I will touch upon briefly here, which Ms. Reid will then detail in the context of addressing how Armenia's purpose supports the indication of the requested measures. First, Azerbaijan has not just found new minefields. It has found explosive booby traps planted in civilian structures in the villages of Zabukh and Sus, which returned to Azerbaijani control in August 2022. These booby traps were planted in places where Azerbaijanis lived and worked before Armenia's occupation and where displaced Azerbaijanis are returning. As I will return to, in these circumstances, the booby traps could serve no military purpose, defensive or otherwise, under international law, and in fact, Armenia denies that its armed forces deployed these booby traps, explicitly acknowledging that their placement in civilian structures could not be justified by some legitimate military aim. As to Armenia's denial of the involvement of its armed forces, Armenia cannot hide behind feigned ignorance of those responsible. As Ms. Reid will detail shortly, the traps were made from military equipment Their construction clearly demonstrates military expertise. So what must that mean? Either the booby traps were laid by the armed forces of Armenia, which the Secretary of the Security Council of Armenia has admitted remained in the formerly occupied territories at least up to September 2022, or by Armenia's forces operating with its installed regime, or by third parties with the assistance or support of such forces which possess the necessary military expertise. Under any scenario, Armenia's conduct implicates plausible rights under Article 2 of CERD, which, as Mr. Lowe went through, sweeps broadly to include the, quote, sponsoring, defending, or supporting, end quote, acts of racial discrimination. Second, Azerbaijan has found and continues to find thousands of recently laid landmines since the time of Azerbaijan's last provisional measures request, most recently in November 2022. Contradicting what Armenia previously told the court, more than half of the landmines found thus far, that's over 1,600 out of over 2,700 landmines, were nowhere near the former line of contact that separated Armenia's and Azerbaijan's troops at the north and east of the formerly occupied territories, and nowhere near the international border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These new landmines were instead laid near villages where Azerbaijanis made up nearly all the population before the occupation, and where Azerbaijani internally displaced persons are returning following the signing of the trilateral statement. Based on their markings, all of these mines were manufactured in Armenia, and nearly all of them were manufactured in 2021, after the trilateral statement had already required the cessation of all hostilities and required all Armenian troops to leave Azerbaijan's territory. They thus cannot be justified by Armenia's prior argument that they were laid in the heat of armed conflict. Third, new statements by departing Armenian settlers make clear that these explosive devices were placed as part of a broader campaign to make the territories returned to Azerbaijan simply unlivable, and to prevent Azerbaijani civilians on the basis of their ethnic and national origin from returning to areas where they had once lived. Armenia will no doubt assert this afternoon, despite this compelling evidence, that the planning of booby traps and landmines did not have the purpose of killing, maiming, and intimidating Azerbaijanis, and otherwise deterring them from exercising fundamental rights because of their ethnic origin or national origin. As I will explain, however, regardless of how Armenia tries to argue its actual purpose, the new evidence still demonstrates that Armenia's planting of booby traps and mines has the effect of depriving Azerbaijanis of their equal enjoyment of fundamental rights by reason of ethnic and national origin. That discriminatory effect alone is sufficient to breach CERD regardless of purpose. The discriminatory effect of Armenia's planting of booby traps and landmines in or near Azerbaijani civilian areas amounts to a breach of CERD. The court needs no reminder that on account of the plain text of Article 1, which defines racial discrimination, CERD prohibits states from engaging in conduct that has the, quote, purpose or effect, end quote, of impairing the equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms on the basis of ethnic or national origin. The use of the disjunctive or here means that it is only necessary to demonstrate either purpose or effect, not both. Therefore, in order to satisfy itself that Azerbaijan's request relates to plausible rights under CERD, the court need only find that Azerbaijan has a plausible case either as to Armenia's discriminatory purpose or as to the discriminatory effects of Armenia's actions. It need not find both. This much the court has already observed. In the case of Qatar versus United Arab Emirates, the court explained that, quote, the convention prohibits all forms and manifestations of racial discrimination, whether arising from the purpose of a given restriction or from its effect, end quote. The committee established by CERD also has emphasized that, quote, the definition of racial discrimination expressly extends beyond measures which are explicitly discriminatory to encompass measures which are not discriminatory at face value, but which are discriminatory in fact and effect, that is, if they amount to indirect discrimination, end quote. This means that, in the words of the committee, CERD is violated not only where measures are discriminatory on their face, but also where an, quote, action has an unjustifiable, disparate impact upon a group distinguished by race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, end quote. Now, the reason that CERD prohibits actions with discriminatory effects is not just because a discriminatory purpose can be hard to prove. Rather, CERD is concerned with the impact of laws, policies, and practices on the potential victim of discrimination. In other words, CERD recognizes that someone can be disadvantaged in the enjoyment of their human rights based on race, ethnic origin, or national origin, even if no one acted with a discriminatory purpose. This point is critical when it comes to rooting out and eliminating all forms of racial discrimination, the animating object and purpose of CERD. As we are all well aware, racism only sometimes manifests directly with an express purpose, declaration of purpose. Indeed, many forms of racial discrimination are especially harmful precisely because discriminatory policies and practices operate in the shadows, and their infringement on fundamental rights is measured and proven only by whether and how a group of people are defined by their ethnic or national origin feels their negative effects. Before I continue with the discriminatory effect of Armenia's conduct, I'll turn briefly to the nature of the rights implicated here. CERD addresses racial discrimination affecting the recognition, exercise, and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Here, there can be no doubt that Armenia's placement of booby traps and landmines implicates fundamental rights recognized under CERD. Most obviously, Article 5, which provides a non-exhaustive list of such fundamental rights, recognizes the, quote, right to security of person and protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, end quote. Placing individuals at risk of death or dismemberment undoubtedly impairs their exercise and enjoyment of the rights to security of person and protection from violence. It follows that placing members of one ethnic or national origin group selectively at risk of death or dismemberment impairs their equal exercise or enjoyment of those rights. Furthermore, displaced persons have a fundamental right to return home after the conclusion of armed conflict. Article 5 of CERD specifically recognizes both the right to, quote, freedom of movement and residence within the border of the state, end quote, and the right, quote, to return to one's country, end quote. Within this framework, the CERD Committee has emphasized the rights of displaced persons to, quote, freely return to their homes of origin under conditions of safety, end quote, following conflicts of an ethnic character. International law also recognizes the right for displaced civilians to return, which underscores that the right to return is a human right and fundamental freedom within the meaning of Article 5 of CERD. By creating fear of death or injury, the presence of booby traps and landmines prevents Azerbaijanis from exercising their right to return on an equal basis. Whatever Armenia's reasons, motivations, or purpose for planting booby traps and mines in the first place, the evidence confirms that the tragic effect of these dangerous explosive devices is to deprive Azerbaijanis of the equal enjoyment of their fundamental rights. I say this because it is only Azerbaijanis, as an ethnic or national origin group, who suffer the disparate impact of Armenia's conduct on their CERD-protected rights, as I will now explain as a matter of plausibility. In explaining this effect, I want to return to the Court's 7 December 2021 order in this case, and in particular to the Court's reference in the context of plausibility to, quote, military means, end quote, that can be used to effectuate, quote, a policy of driving persons of a certain national or ethnic origin from a particular area, as well as preventing their return thereto, end quote. In Azerbaijan's present request, Azerbaijan points the court to recent unconscionable conduct on the part of Armenia in planting landmines and booby traps in civilian areas of Azerbaijan's territory after Armenia committed in the trilateral statement to, quote, cease all hostilities, end quote. The question then becomes, do these military means effectuate a racially discriminatory policy by Armenia of preventing the return of Azerbaijanis to their homes in the formerly occupied territories? The answer lies in understanding the roots of Armenia's highly organized, state-sponsored campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting Azerbaijanis, as well as the effect that the booby traps and landmines have on the present rights of Azerbaijanis to return to their homes in safety. In other words, what I will go through in the next few minutes explains how Armenia's use of military means here and today fits into a long-standing racially discriminatory policy such that they raise plausible rights under CERD. Last week, Azerbaijan submitted its memorial demonstrating that, among other things, Armenia's conduct through its invasion and occupation of Azerbaijan's territory has both discriminatory purpose and effect. Today, we do not seek to delve into the merits of the evidence submitted. For today's purposes, I focus only on the evidence of the continuing effect of Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing on the rights of Azerbaijanis to return home that are relevant to demonstrating the plausibility of Azerbaijan's request. In the early 1990s, Armenia invaded Azerbaijan's territory and killed or expelled ethnic Azerbaijanis while allowing ethnic Armenians who were living there to remain. For almost 4 years, between 1991 and 1994, Armenia would go on to defy 4 Security Council resolutions demanding the complete withdrawal of the occupying troops. By the time a ceasefire was established in 1994, Armenia legally occupied approximately 1/5 of Azerbaijan's internationally recognized territory. All in all, in its campaign, Armenia violently expelled more than 1 million Azerbaijanis from their homes, more than 700,000 Azerbaijanis from the occupied territories, more than 200,000 Azerbaijanis from Armenia, and more than 100,000 from border areas. On the map before you, the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan are outlined with a dotted line, with the districts marked in blue being overwhelmingly populated by Azerbaijanis prior to Armenia's occupation. You can see the previous Azerbaijani population figures on the screen as well. By 1994, not a single Azerbaijani remained in any of the occupied territories as a result of Armenia's acts of ethnic cleansing. The effect of Armenia's conduct on the rights of Azerbaijanis is open, notorious, and well documented, including by international bodies, and especially with respect to the rights of Azerbaijanis internally displaced persons, or IDPs, which is at issue in this request. For example, each of the Security Council resolutions condemning the occupation expressed in similar terms the, quote, grave concern at the human suffering the conflict has caused and at the serious humanitarian emergency in the region, end quote, and the, quote, grave concern at the displacement of large numbers of civilians in the Azerbaijani Republic, end quote. In 1994, the United Nations General Assembly recognized that, quote, the number of refugees and displaced persons in Azerbaijan has recently exceeded 1 million, end quote. And in its September 2003 report, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees confirmed that, quote, as a result of Armenian aggression and ethnic cleansing of Azerbaijanis, both from the territory of Armenia itself and from occupied Azerbaijani lands, there are now some 1 million refugees and displaced persons in Azerbaijan, end quote. As a result of these actions, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Azerbaijan retains one of the highest per capita concentrations of IDPs in the world. During its occupation, Armenia also settled ethnic Armenians from Armenia and third countries in the occupied territories in violation of international law which prohibits such settlement during occupation. As an OSCE fact-finding mission found in a 2005 report, Armenia intended through the settlements to transform the occupied territories into a mono-ethnic Armenian area, and by making this a fait accompli, and I quote, sought to prevent Azerbaijanis from ever returning. On re-entering the formerly occupied territories in 2020, Azerbaijan discovered that Armenia had completely devastated the areas where Azerbaijanis had lived. Azerbaijani homes, businesses, towns, cities, and heritage sites had been entirely obliterated. For example, you can see on the screen a still from a video taken by drone in the city of Agdam after the occupation. Confirms that today all that remains of the once bustling city with a population of approximately 39,000 Azerbaijanis are the bare foundations of looted and destroyed buildings. The same is true for Jabrayil and Fuzuli, two of the largest cities with Azerbaijani populations prior to the occupation. This devastation is not the result of bombardment during war. Rather, Armenia systematically dismantled these cities during occupation to prevent Azerbaijanis from ever returning and to wipe out any evidence that they'd been present. An OSCE mission that visited the area in 2010 confirmed that the districts where Azerbaijanis had lived prior to the occupation were, quote, generally in ruins, end quote, and, quote, do not offer conditions suitable for return, end quote. This takes me to my final point with respect to the rights implicated by this discriminatory policy. How do we know the policy was discriminatory against Azerbaijanis as a matter of their ethnic or national origin? Precisely because of the differential impact on Azerbaijanis. Areas and districts where ethnic Armenians had resided and continued to reside did not suffer such devastation during Armenia's occupation. Since 2020, Azerbaijan had been building the Karabakh Digital Geoinformation System, the KDGS, which is a database comprised of verified digital maps, drone and satellite images, archival Soviet-era information, and information collected by relevant Azerbaijani government agencies. The KDGS catalogs the post-occupation destruction and substantial damage to tens of thousands of Azerbaijani homes, public buildings, and cultural and religious sites and objects. Through this online tool, the court is able to compare the before and after effects of the occupation. For example, on the left side of the screen, you see a digital map of the city of Agdam depicting the existing structures before occupation. As you can see, the city was well developed. It had a population of 39,000 Azerbaijanis prior to the occupation. As the slider comes across, you see the exact same. Let me wait a moment for it to get back up. As the slider comes across, the slider doesn't appear to be working, but we will provide subsequently some stills of what it looks like. You will see the exact same digital map, but post-occupation, which demonstrates the staggering scope of destruction of the homes and structures of Azerbaijanis. What few buildings remained after the occupation are marked in red. In contrast, on the right is the digital map of the small Haut of Hadrut, populated by around 1,500 ethnic Armenians prior to our occupation. As you can see, pre-existing homes and structures remain. And again, we'll provide you a still of the after. But not only was Hadrut not destroyed during occupation, it was substantially built up over the course of Armenia's occupation. This is what disparate impact based on ethnic or national origin looks like. This is what the effects of a racially discriminatory policy look like. The tragic effects of Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign continue to be felt today, even after Armenia signed the trilateral statement in November 2020. These effects did not end when Armenia acknowledged in signing that statement the right of Azerbaijani IDPs to return home, which was made explicit in paragraph 7. We know it did not end because when Azerbaijan entered those territories to start reconstruction works and otherwise prepare for the long-awaited return home of Azerbaijani IDPs, it was met with booby traps and landmines placed in precisely those civilian areas where Azerbaijanis are to return. We also know it did not end because the already too long list of Azerbaijanis injured or killed by these devices continues to grow, and the risk of adding further to that list is ever present. I turn now to my final point, that is addressing the military means that today continue to effectuate this racially discriminatory policy by preventing the return of Azerbaijanis to their homes in the formerly occupied territories. As the court has heard, the trilateral statement required Armenia to immediately cease hostilities, to return to Azerbaijani control the districts of Agdam, Kalbajar, and most of Lachen, and to withdraw its armed forces from all other parts of Azerbaijan's territory, in parallel with the deployment of peacekeeping forces from the Russian Federation. In 2022, the Lachen Road was relocated under the terms of the trilateral statement so that the town of Lachen and the villages of Zubukh and Sus could be returned to Azerbaijan's control in order to facilitate the return of Azerbaijani IDPs to those settlements. But before returning those settlements to Azerbaijan in August 2022, a campaign of deliberate destruction, burning, and vandalization of houses and other civilian structures ensued, leaving the area desolate. Annex 24 details the devastation documented by the Azerbaijan Prosecutor General's office in these settlements, including, for example, 502 residential houses with identified prior Azerbaijani owners that were damaged or destroyed in the town of Lachen alone. In addition, in October 2022, after Azerbaijan began preparing these settlements for the return of IDPs, Azerbaijan found the booby traps, hidden and rigged to be triggered by tripwire. The cumulative effect of the deployment of these booby traps is the interference of the fundamental rights of Azerbaijanis as an ethnic and national origin group. Why do I say that? Because each of Armenia's booby traps was found in a civilian structure, including 4 in residential homes, 1 in a sewing factory, 1 in an agricultural stable. Azerbaijan has been able to identify the Azerbaijani individual or family who lived in the homes in which these traps were found using aerial footage from the Soviet area and property information collected from the Azerbaijanis who lived in these areas prior to Armenia's occupation. On the screen before you is a photo of one of the booby traps in Zubukh, along with the property record for the home where it was found, showing that it was a, quote, individual residential house, end quote, owned by an Azerbaijani. On this map, the satellite imagery reflects the post-occupation landscape, and the blue box marks where the booby trap was found. This booby trap was likewise found in an individual residential house where an Azerbaijani lived in Sus. The booby traps were placed only in houses or other civilian structures that belonged to ethnic Azerbaijanis before Armenia's occupation, and to which the original owners are to return after Armenia's troops departed. Likewise, as Ms. Reed will detail, the landmines manufactured in 2021 were laid near settlements where ethnic Azerbaijanis were expected to return. To state the obvious, they were not placed in settlements where ethnic Armenians were expected to remain. The discriminatory effect of these explosive devices on Azerbaijanis is clear. Azerbaijanis and only Azerbaijanis were to return to these towns, villages, and homes. Azerbaijanis and only Azerbaijanis are experiencing the continuing disparate impact as a group distinguished by national or ethnic origin. The effect of Armenia's mining and booby trapping falls upon Azerbaijanis alone. In 2021, on the previous provisional measures request, Armenia argued that landmines don't discriminate. They can be detonated by people of all ethnic groups. We expect that Armenia may make a similar argument again today. But with respect, it could be said that a gun doesn't discriminate either, but the person aiming the gun can. It is self-evident that it is the deployment of dangerous explosive weapons, not the devices themselves, that can in fact discriminate against a group on the basis of ethnic or national origin based on their use and placement. Armenia may also attempt to argue this afternoon that the court should disregard the indisputable negative impact of its actions on the equal enjoyment of the rights of Azerbaijanis because Armenia feels justified by some legitimate aim, likely a defensive military aim. Here, however, Armenia cannot find or resort to an argument that the disparate impact on Azerbaijanis could somehow be justified on the basis of legitimate aims where indiscriminate booby traps were planted in Azerbaijani homes and other civilian structures in areas Armenia agreed to and was to leave per the trilateral statement. That Armenia lacks a legitimate purpose with respect to its conduct is true under international humanitarian law, which, as even Armenia acknowledges in its Annex 1, is violated by the placement of booby traps in these circumstances. This is the case even as CERD imposes separate and distinct obligations such that the breach of one is not necessarily a breach of the other. In this way, the impermissible effect of Armenia's conduct in Azerbaijanis is what breaches CERD, regardless of Armenia's purpose in planning the booby traps and landmines. Further, Article 2 of CERD specifically requires states to, quote, bring to an end, end quote, existing racial discrimination. And in the words of the CERD committee, states must adopt, quote, all appropriate measures, end quote, to remedy the disparate impact of their discriminatory actions. For that reason, Armenia's ongoing refusal to take the steps necessary to stop further deaths and injuries is a further breach of CERD. To conclude, the new evidence of Armenia's use of booby traps and landmines in this fashion constitutes the, quote, military means, end quote, of a discriminatory policy, the clear effect of which is to subject Azerbaijanis as an ethnic or national origin group to the risk of bodily injury and death, and to prevent their return home, which implicates rights under CERD. Under the definition of racial discrimination in Article 1 of CERD, this showing of discriminatory effect is itself sufficient to find for Azerbaijan on the plausibility of the rights claimed. I thank the Court for its kind attention and ask, Madam President, that you call Ms. Natalie Reid to the lectern.
You have the floor now.
Madam President, honorable members of the Court, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. The evidence in this case shows that Armenia's campaign of booby-trapping Azerbaijani homes and laying landmines in or near Azerbaijani villages has not just the effect, but also the purpose of reinforcing Armenia's project of maintaining a mono-ethnic Armenian settlement in the formerly occupied territories. Azerbaijan's request thus raises plausible rights under CERD. I begin with the evidence of Armenia's policy of discrimination against Azerbaijanis. Last week, Azerbaijan submitted its memorial demonstrating that Armenia acted with discriminatory purpose throughout its armed aggression and occupation of Azerbaijan's sovereign territory, including the violent expulsion of every single Azerbaijani living in the occupied territories. The evidence that Azerbaijan has submitted to the Court in its memorial and the accompanying annexes sets out in great detail the brutal nature and devastating consequences of Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign, including the steps it took to prevent and deter those displaced Azerbaijani civilians from exercising their right to return to their homes. Given the limited time available this morning, I respectfully refer the Court to last week's submission for the full discussion of Armenia's breaches in this regard. For purposes of today's argument, it suffices to highlight a few points that demonstrate the continuity of purpose and of plan in Armenia's deliberate use of explosive devices targeted at the displaced Azerbaijani civilians who plan to return to their homes in the liberated territories. First, Armenia has made no secret of its intentions. In an interview he gave in 2000, former President and Prime Minister Sargsyan explained Armenia's massacre of Azerbaijani civilians at Khojaly in 1992 by stating, and I quote, Before Khojaly, Azerbaijanis thought Armenians could not raise hand at innocent civilians. It was necessary to break all this, so it happened. Close quote. And in case there was doubt about the reason for Armenia's aggression and occupation of Azerbaijan's territory and the integration of the occupied territories into a greater Armenia, he stated bluntly, the most important thing is not the territory. It's that one ethnic group is left in Armenia. Mr. Sargsyan was not alone in those views. To this day, his political party, the Republican Party of Armenia, which ruled Armenia for 20 of the 30 years of the occupation, still proudly calls itself, and I quote, the ideological and political successor of Nejde Segakron, with Garagin Nejde's teaching as its ideological basis. Why is that meaningful in a Surd context? These are just some of the teachings of Nejde. That Azerbaijanis have, and I quote, for centuries had more dog traits than human ones. That being a Segakron, the very thing celebrated on the RPA website, and I quote, requires worshipping the blood of the race and defeating the enemy of my race, the Turks, end quote, where Turks is a term widely used in Armenia to refer to Azerbaijanis. Second, Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign was merciless, and its racially motivated nature was evidenced by the deliberate targeting of symbols of Azerbaijani culture and identity. These attacks on cultural objects are compelling evidence of ethnic animus, as the court acknowledged in the Bosnia genocide case, and I quote, deliberate destruction of the historical, cultural, and religious heritage of a protected group may be highly significant inasmuch as it is directed to the elimination of all traces of the group's cultural or religious presence. That deliberate destruction is what Azerbaijan found upon liberation. In headstones across the formerly occupied territories, in Agdam, Fuzuli, Gubadli, Jabrail, Kelbajar, Lachin, and Zengilan, the faces of deceased Azerbaijanis on headstones were shot at, scratched out, or obliterated in a blatant display of hatred. These photographs show the remnants of the famous mosaic of the Agdam Bread Museum, which before Armenia's occupation showed men, women, and children in traditional dress, carrying symbols of Agdam and musical instruments. Now, as you can see, the remaining mosaic tiles are scarred with bullet holes targeting the faces, breasts, and genitals of the Azerbaijani women, and the child one of them holds in her arms. Third, Armenia did not end its scorched earth campaign when it agreed to the trilateral statement. On the contrary, it continued the campaign in the areas that it had explicitly agreed to return to Azerbaijan, including the district of Kelbajar and most of the district of Lachin. The purpose was clear. For example, one Armenian soldier in the Kelbajar district was recorded as saying, in reference to the returning Azerbaijanis, "Let them live here if they can," as he burned an Azerbaijani house to the ground. When the former route of the Lachin corridor was returned to Azerbaijan's control just a few months ago, some of the departing settlers destroyed and defiled the houses they had occupied, rather than see those homes peacefully returned to their rightful owners. We see this in a video clip of an Armenian settler submitted in Annex 4 to Azerbaijan's request, who did not want, and I quote, the Turk to benefit of this house, and used lighter fluid, a broom, and a match to burn it to the ground. We see it in the photographs also submitted in Annex 4 of the deliberate ethnically motivated insults left for returning Azerbaijanis to find in their home. A severed pig's foot hanging from a light fixture, its blood splashed on the walls. And to drive it home, the words pig's blood smeared on that wall, in that blood, in Cyrillic Azerbaijani. This is what ethnic hatred looks like. Targeted at a population driven from their homes and returning decades later to be greeted by this devastation and desecration. To Azerbaijan's knowledge, none of these acts of deliberate, cruel vandalism and destruction have been properly investigated or punished by Armenia. Instead, Armenia has welcomed and compensated the settlers who sought to leave behind a ruin to which no Azerbaijani could or would return. Armenia's supplemental Annex 2, filed last week, does not change this picture. On the contrary, it confirms that neither Armenia nor its installed regime is serious about actually deterring these kinds of hate crimes, because any criminal charges brought were dropped on spurious grounds. Armenia's planting of booby traps and laying of landmines manufactured in 2021 in areas it agreed to return to Azerbaijan, specifically to effect the return of Azerbaijani IDPs, likewise reflects Armenia's ongoing purpose to make the formerly occupied territories uninhabitable by Azerbaijanis. Deterring Azerbaijanis from ever returning to their homes is an essential element of Armenia's goal to make and keep the formerly occupied territories a permanently mono-ethnic Armenian area, ethnically cleansed of Azerbaijanis. As noted, Azerbaijan has found booby traps in civilian homes and other civilian buildings that had belonged to Azerbaijanis before the occupation. Armenia does not dispute that the booby traps were found in these locations, nor does it dispute that it is never permissible under international law to place booby traps in these civilian areas. That is self-evident outside the context of armed hostilities. But even in times of war, as the ICRC has explained, quote, the use of booby traps which are in any way attached to or associated with objects or persons entitled to special protection under international humanitarian law, or with objects that are likely to attract civilians, is prohibited, close quote. International law likewise obliges Armenia not to impede the safe return of IDPs to their homes. In short, there is no acceptable excuse. Whatever reason Armenia could offer for laying landmines cannot apply to booby-trapping civilians' homes in areas where Armenia knew Azerbaijani IDPs would be returning. As Armenia itself admits in its Annex 1, where it tries to distance itself from these horrific devices, booby traps are, and I quote, too unpredictable and ineffective for military operations, end quote. Too ineffective for war, but very ineffective at inflicting terror. This afternoon, Armenia will undoubtedly contend that it bears no responsibility for these booby traps. That is the only argument it has left. But just consider what is shown by the photographs now on the screen of the devices discovered by Azerbaijan. On the left, the booby trap attached to a stable door in Sus is a hand grenade rigged so that the action of opening the door pulls the pin. Packed around the grenade are sharp metal nails that would become deadly shrapnel in the ensuing explosion, radiating out to hit anyone within reach. In the middle, the booby trap, discovered in a sewing factory in Zabukh, is comprised of a hand grenade hidden under an anti-personnel mine, so that lifting the mine after it is deactivated will detonate the grenade. On the right, the device consists of not one, not two, but 3 anti-personnel explosive wave mines stacked on top of each other. To be clear, this is not the work of an angry settler destroying a home with household items rather than see it go back to an Azerbaijani. These and the devices shown on previous slides were constructed with military equipment: hand grenades, detonators, rifle grenades, landmines, and mortar shells, carefully rigged to explode when someone opens a door, steps across a threshold, or lifts a mine they believe they have safely deactivated. Moreover, constructing and placing these kinds of booby traps without inadvertently detonating them requires specific training and expertise. It reflects specialized knowledge of explosives and specialized knowledge of mine clearance practices to have the kind of targeting reflected in the grenade hidden under the mine. It is implausible, to put it mildly, that these devices could have been designed, constructed, and laid without the involvement of the Armenian military. And in any event, as Mr. Lowe explained, Article 2 of CERD requires Armenia not to, quote, sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination, close quote, and Armenia cannot evade responsibility by arguing that someone else planted the booby traps if they were acting with Armenia's sponsorship or support. Finally, it will not escape the court, in considering both the technical expertise demonstrated and the purpose that motivated it, that in each one of these instances, the booby traps are carefully and intentionally designed to maximize the harm inflicted, to delay or prevent their safe removal, to target the people engaged in clearing mines, and to ensure deaths, not just injuries. Azerbaijan does not know how many more booby traps it will find, or where they may be hidden. But that is precisely the point. Keeping secret and unknowable the location and number of traps and the degree of risk that Azerbaijanis face in returning to their homes serves Armenia's purpose of terrorizing Azerbaijani civilians into staying away from their homes in the formerly occupied territories. This evidence amply satisfies the requirement of a plausible showing of a CERD breach. There is no conceivable military purpose and no possible justification for Armenia's use of booby traps to target returning Azerbaijani civilians and those engaged in the mine clearance work that will make it safe for those IDPs to return home. In these circumstances, the racially discriminatory purpose of the booby traps is undeniable. New evidence also shows that Armenia laid new landmines in Azerbaijan's territory after the ceasefire went into effect in November 2020, not in the heat of combat or chaos of retreat, as Armenia previously claimed. As Azerbaijan has sought to bring these landmines to the attention of the international community, Armenia has repeatedly disclaimed any responsibility. But as its denials are refuted by evidence, as its representations to the court are belied by the facts, Armenia keeps changing its story. And as the evidence has mounted of Armenia's continued practice of planting landmines in Azerbaijan's territory after the trilateral statement, its excuses have grown ever more fanciful. In the last hearing, in October 2021, Armenia's agent and counsel assured the court that it is, quote, not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan, specifically including in the territory where Russian peacekeepers are now temporarily deployed. The landmines in these territories, Armenia argued, were, quote, defensive landmines that had been, quote, left in place along the line of contact in the eastern and northern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, end quote, quote, given the military purpose that they served, end quote. The true facts began to come to light last summer. In August 2022, Azerbaijan found 1,259 Armenian mines, all of them manufactured in 2021, near the villages of Ikinci and Birinci.
Excuse me, Ms. Reed. Could you slow down the pace of your remarks, please, for the benefit of the interpreters? Thank you.
Yes, Madam President. Azerbaijan then found an additional minefield consisting of 350 mines near Ikinci in November 2022, again consisting entirely of mines manufactured in Armenia in 2021. Azerbaijan also found Armenian-made mines near the village of Baglipaya in Kalbajar district in August 2022. All three villages were inhabited by ethnic Azerbaijanis before Armenia's occupation, and are areas to which those expelled from their homes will be returning. In response to these alarming discoveries, Azerbaijan immediately raised the issue with Russian peacekeepers. Since Armenia had to be using the Lachin Road, the only route connecting Armenia with the formerly occupied territories, and which, as you heard yesterday, is under Russian peacekeeper control, to transport those mines into Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan also alerted the United Nations in August, November, and December, and the court in September 2022. Armenia denied that it had anything to do with these mines. In October 2022, for example, Armenia told the OSCE that it does not even manufacture landmines, a claim it has repeated for many years. So the unearthed mines that Azerbaijan has been documenting could not be Armenian. Armenia went even further and alleged that Azerbaijan itself must have planted its own mines in, quote, areas that came under its control as a result of incursion into the territory of Armenia. Armenia made similar denials in its responses to Azerbaijan's letters to the court, including its letter of 27 September 2022. We now know that Armenia's claim that it does not make landmines was false. As the evidence submitted by Azerbaijan shows, an Armenian company headquartered in Yerevan, HaEkmek, has made weapons and ordnance for the armed forces of Armenia, including landmines, under license from Armenia for the last 19 years. Annexes 29 through 31 to Azerbaijan's request show the decisions of the Armenian government to issue that license to HaEkmek in 2004 and to renew it at regular intervals in the following years. The mines that HaEkmek manufactures are the same mines that Azerbaijan discovered in its territory starting in August 2022. The court will also recall that back in October 2021, Armenia's counsel assured the court that any, quote, fresh set of explosive remnants of war was spawned by the 2020 conflict, and argued that it would be implausible to think that such mines, which it described as having been laid, quote, in the heat of a sudden military attack, end quote, were for the purpose of, quote, anything other than defensive maneuvers, close quote. We now know that this is not true. The mines Azerbaijan has unearthed have markings required by the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons that identify their origin and date of manufacture. In this photograph, the red box on the left indicates the location where the mines were manufactured, in Yerevan. And critically, the box on the right indicates the year that each of these mines was manufactured, 21 for 2021. So the thousands of these new landmines that Azerbaijan has so far discovered in its territory were manufactured in 2021, and thus could only have been laid well after Armenia agreed in the trilateral statement to, quote, a complete ceasefire and termination of all military activities, and the withdrawal of its armed forces from Azerbaijan's territory. Faced with this evidence, Armenia's latest annex submission no longer denies that the mines are in fact Armenian, or that they were in fact manufactured in 2021. But even as it concedes these facts, Armenia refuses to admit the final fact that would doom its defense, that these 2021 mines were transported into Azerbaijan and planted by Armenia exactly where Azerbaijan discovered them, in locations close to civilians' homes. Instead, it insists in its Annex 1 that the landmines were, quote, taken by Azerbaijan from the sovereign territories of the Republic of Armenia, close quote. But this claim does not withstand scrutiny. In November 2022, as shown on the screen, Azerbaijan invited several foreign military attachés to inspect the landmines that it discovered in Lachin in that month. Members of the press corps were also invited to document this newsworthy event in Azerbaijan's territory. In other words, Azerbaijan did not just tell the world that it had found these landmines where it said it did, it showed them. To understand exactly what Armenia is now claiming, the screen shows a map with the areas in question. On that map, the places where Armenia now claims Azerbaijan dug up the mines are located to the left of the dotted red line illustrating the border between the two states. So Armenia's latest story is that Azerbaijan entered these areas, dug up thousands of these deadly devices without accidentally detonating any of them, then either disarmed all of them immediately or transported thousands of armed devices across the entire breadth of Lachin district, all to set up a staged photo shoot. Madam President, honorable members of the court, that is not a plausible explanation. It is fantasy, unsupported by a shred of evidence. Now, this afternoon, Armenia may try to change its story yet again and claim that even if Azerbaijan did in fact discover the mines in its territory, there is a legitimate defensive purpose for laying these mines. But again, consider the evidence. More than 1,600 of the newly discovered mines were planted in or near civilian areas in Lachin and Kalbajar districts, shown by the orange triangles on the map. There is no apparent military purpose to lay mines in these areas. They are far from the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and far from the old line of contact between the parties' armed forces in the northern and eastern parts of the formerly occupied territories, which is shown by the thick red line along the top of the map on the screen. In its quest for a viable defense, Armenia's new annexes suggest that it may claim that there is another, newer, quote, line of contact, end quote, between the so-called Defense Army and Azerbaijan, quote, according to the trilateral statement. As Azerbaijan's agent has explained, however, there is no such thing. The trilateral statement does not contemplate, much less condone, the creation of a new line of contact deep in Azerbaijan's territory. It mandates, quote, the withdrawal of Armenian troops, end quote, and the return of these areas to Azerbaijan. Active hostilities had ended. Russian peacekeepers had been deployed to a specific area in the liberated territories, and Armenia knew that Azerbaijani IDPs would be returning to the very areas it was handing over, which had been populated exclusively by ethnic Azerbaijanis prior to the occupation. Laying landmines in these circumstances serves no purpose except to kill, harm, and intimidate Azerbaijani civilians. Unable now to disclaim production of the mines or to offer any legitimate justification for laying them, Armenia may try two last lines of defense, both equally unavailing. First, Armenia suggests in its Annex 1 that the areas on and around Saribaba Heights, where the over 1,600 mines near the villages of Ikinci İpek and Birinci İpek were found, were, quote, not civilian settlements, but open, uninhabited areas, close quote. But the Azerbaijanis who lived and will live again in these villages are, of course, not confined to their homes. They include farmers, shepherds, cattle herders who have every right to use the surrounding lands without stumbling into minefields. This is no hypothetical danger. Several Azerbaijanis have been killed or injured by landmines while farming or tending to livestock since the trilateral statement was signed. Next, Armenia has submitted evidence from the Halo Trust depicting casualties from landmines and unexploded ordnance in Karabakh between 1995 and 2021. No one is disputing that mine contamination has been a long-standing problem across the liberated territories. Indeed, the total number of Azerbaijani casualties from mines and ordnance dating back to 1991 is 3,361 persons. But that does not change the urgent situation that brings Azerbaijan to the court today. Armenia's continued laying of new mines after the trilateral statement in areas targeting Azerbaijani civilians. To summarize then, Armenia's claim that it does not make landmines? False. Its representation to the court that any new mines were laid only in the context of active military operations in late 2020? False. Its explanations for the discovery of these Armenian-made landmines in or near civilian areas, far away from any border or former line of contact? Sheer fantasy, supported only by a deliberate misreading of the trilateral statement. Most importantly, regardless of any asserted military purpose, CERD forbids the use of mines if either their purpose or effect is to prevent Azerbaijani civilians from returning to their homes or otherwise nullify or impair their human rights on the basis of ethnic origin or national origin. In the absence of any recognizable, non-discriminatory military purpose, the inference of a racially discriminatory purpose becomes unavoidable. And Armenia's refusal to disclose information about its minefields that will save civilian lives is inexcusable, whether under customary or conventional international law or under the elementary considerations of humanity discussed by Mr. Lowe. The evidence Azerbaijan has submitted makes clear that Armenia's booby traps and landmines were planted for the purpose and have the effect of placing Azerbaijanis as an ethnic or national origin group selectively at risk of death or dismemberment and of deterring their exercise of their right to return home. Either the purpose or the effect of Armenia's conduct is a sufficient and independent ground to grant the requested measures. Both undeniably implicate plausible rights under CERD. I thank the Court for its kind attention and ask that you call Professor Boisson de Chazoun to address the link between the requested measures and the rights that are in issue, as well as the urgent need for the Court's intervention.
I thank Ms. Reid, and I now invite Professor Laurence Boisson de Chazoun to address the Court. You have the floor, Professor.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it's a major honour for me to appear before your Court on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Let me start off with looking at the link between the rights invoked and the measures requested by the Republic of Azerbaijan, and subsequently I'll look at the imminent and real risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights in issue. My colleagues, Mrs. Amerfar and Reid, have demonstrated that the rights claimed by Azerbaijan are plausible. Now, it falls to me at this stage to demonstrate that another condition for handing down provisional measures is met, namely, that there has to be a link between the rights whose protection is sought and the provisional measures being requested. On this point, I can be brief. There is indeed a clear link between the plausible rights that Azerbaijan seeks to preserve under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CERD, and the provisional measures requested. Each and every measure requested by Azerbaijan is aimed at preventing Armenia from denying the fundamental rights to security, safety, and the right of Azerbaijani citizens to return to their homes, and that includes Azerbaijani IDPs. To this day, Azerbaijan has no certainty that Armenia will not continue to lay landmines and booby traps in civilian areas of Azerbaijan. To the contrary, Azerbaijan continues to discover an alarming number of Armenian landmines. Since August 2022, Azerbaijan has found more than 2,700 landmines manufactured in Armenia in 2021. Now let me underscore this date, 2021. Armenia has quite simply continued to lay mines in Azerbaijan in total disregard of its obligation under CERD and other international instruments, and that includes the Trilateral Declaration. In this respect, let me recall to the Court's attention what Armenia said before your Court in 2021, namely that they had never used mines to target persons of Azerbaijani ethnic origin, not before the armed conflict in 2020, not during that armed conflict, and not thereafter. Now, as you heard today. In October 2022, Azerbaijan found booby traps in civilian homes in the villages of Zabuk and Sus in the region of Lachin. These booby traps were found in hallways, behind entry doors, and in the courtyards of some of these homes. The provisional measures requested are aimed at protecting the rights of Azerbaijanis under the CERD against these real and imminent threats. As long as Azerbaijan does not enjoy the cooperation of Armenia, thanks to provisional measures which you will hand down, Azerbaijan will not be able to rapidly and efficiently eliminate the explosive devices on its territory, and its population's lives will remain in danger. The measures requested are specifically targeting the extant menaces threatening Azerbaijanis either in the civilian areas of newly liberated territories or seeking to return there. The aim of these provisional measures, is to put an end to the unlawful actions of Armenia directed against Azerbaijanis on the basis of ethnic or national origin. These measures are vital to ensure the safety of Azerbaijanis and to ensure that Azerbaijanis, including those who are working to rebuild the liberated territories, can return there without the constant threat of death or serious injury. These measures aim at preserving the specific rights provided under Articles 2 through 5 of the CERD. The Court, I quote you, has the power to indicate provisional measures when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings, or when the alleged disregard of such rights may entail irreparable consequences. End of quotation. Furthermore, the Court has also declared that you would only exercise this power, I quote, if there is urgency in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights claimed before the Court gives its final decision. End of citation. The irreparable prejudice which Azerbaijan is trying to protect itself against via provisional measures is quite simple. It's nothing more nor less than a question of life or death. Since the signature of the Trilateral Declaration, explosive devices laid by Armenia, such as landmines and booby traps, have made 282 Azerbaijani victims, including 33 civilians killed and 86 wounded by landmines. Since the Court handed down its order on 7 December 2021, landmines have accounted for 45 civilian victims, and that includes workers on building sites, reconstruction building sites, and individuals engaged in mine clearance operations. Furthermore, the number of victims that I've just mentioned isn't a static, fixed number. Quite to the contrary, it can evolve significantly. Indeed, both the finding of these explosive devices and the collection of documentation regarding the deaths caused by them require lengthy and fastidious investigations. The civilian population affected by the current conflict is extremely vulnerable. Recurring blasts are making conditions increasingly difficult for Azerbaijanis returning to their territories. To this day, numerous uncertainties remain regarding the exact number and location of landmines and booby traps deployed by Armenia on Azerbaijani territory in the regions formerly inhabited by Azerbaijani civilians. And because of this, Azerbaijanis are faced with a very difficult choice: to not be able to return to the lands from which they've been exiled during the 30-year Armenian occupation, or to return at the risk of their lives. Azerbaijan requests the Court now to order the provisional measures requested in order to preserve rights protected by CERD from the real and imminent risk which threatens them. On a number of occasions, the Court has handed down provisional measures regarding the protection of fundamental rights enshrined in the CERD. In its order of 7 December 2021, the Court recognised that Articles 5b and 5d, which are the subject of the Azerbaijani request, as well as other provisions of the CERD, are, I quote, are such that prejudice to them could be irreparable. End of quotation. In the case Georgia versus Russia, the Court considered, I quote, that violations of the right to the security of persons and of the right to protection by the state against violence or bodily harm, Article 5, Para B, could involve potential loss of life or bodily injury, and could therefore cause irreparable prejudice. End of quotation. Your Court also indicated, I quote, violations of the right to freedom of movement and residence within the state borders, paragraph D.I, could also cause irreparable prejudice in situations where the persons concerned are exposed to privation, hardship, anguish, and even danger to life and health. End of quotation. The Court concludes from this that, I quote, individuals forced to leave their own place of residence and deprived of their right to return could, depending on the circumstances, be subject to a serious risk of irreparable prejudice. End of quotation. By exposing Azerbaijanis to a constant threat of death or serious injury in or near civilian areas, towns and villages of liberated territories, Armenia is subjecting Azerbaijanis to a distressing and harrowing fate and posing serious risks for their very lives. As my colleagues, Ms. Amafar and Ms. Reid, explained, the actions undertaken by Armenia have for purpose and effect the targeting of Azerbaijanis on account of their ethnic and national origin. The rights protected by CERD, including that of the security of person, freedom of movement, and residence within the border of a state, are thus undermined and are vulnerable to irreparable prejudice, as the Court has already observed. There is a real and imminent risk that this irreparable prejudice will take place before the Court rules on the merits of the case. Furthermore, Armenia's laying of landmines and booby traps in or near civilian areas in Azerbaijan, and this since November 2020, and the refusal of Armenia, furthermore, to provide information on the location, the quantity, type, or characteristics of said devices, present an imminent menace and threat. Without the measures requested, Armenia's actions will continue to threaten and to wound, to kill, and to destroy the lives of many Azerbaijanis. The resulting consequences would be irreparable and in breach of Article 5 of CERD. Now, as your Court has pointed out, let me quote you again, the condition of urgency is met when the acts susceptible of causing irreparable prejudice can occur at any moment before the Court makes a final decision on the case. End of quotation. Your Court has also pointed out that the risk of irreparable prejudice is real and imminent when the affected group, I quote, remains vulnerable with regard to their rights under Article 5 of the Convention. End of quote. Similarly, the Court considered that such risks exist when there is evidence that these acts are ongoing, or that prior acts are such that, I continue to quote, the consequences apparently resulting from this situation and that the impact on those affected seem to persist to this date. End of quotation. Now, in the instant case, violations are ongoing and they do risk persisting unless the Court intervenes. Every single time an Azerbaijani has sought to return to their land of origin, their lives have been endangered. Azerbaijan has done everything it possibly can to mitigate this danger, inter alia by limiting the movement of population in the zones not yet cleared of mines. But despite these protective measures, certain Azerbaijanis have not been able to resist the desire to return to those territories from which they have been separated for almost 30 years. And the danger is everywhere. Armenia didn't just deploy explosive devices in those regions formerly inhabited by civilian population. We've also placed these mines in holy places, for example, in cemeteries. For example, on 21 October 2022, the blast from a landmine in a village cemetery in Suarezi Lachin killed one person and wounded another. There is no doubt, therefore, that landmines and booby traps deployed by Armenia impair the right of return of Azerbaijani IDPs. Now, this is a real tragedy, and it's a real tragedy which is happening in full view of everyone. The continuing and targeted deployment of Armenia of mines in civilian areas constitutes a serious threat to Azerbaijani mine clearing and reconstruction endeavours within Azerbaijani territory, which have been devastated by 30 years of occupation. Since the liberation of these territories, Azerbaijan has done everything it could to revitalise them, to rebuild them, to facilitate the return of Azerbaijani IDPs as fast as possible. Now, some IDPs have just but one wish: go back home. I'm just going to quote one example here. Let me mention the testimony of Madame Zabila Mamadova, an Azerbaijani and internally displaced person who used to teach in the town of Susha. In February 21, what did she say?
It's taking almost 30 years for Susa to be liberated so we can return. Or how should I say it? To run back there. Fancy.
End of quote. Now, to this end, Azerbaijan adopted a state program which is known as the Great Return, Le Grand Retour in French, to facilitate the return home of IDPs. Numerous are those currently working on the reconstruction building sites in the regions of Lachin and Kalbachar, and hundreds of other Azerbaijanis are working at mine clearance operations in these territories. Now, every day that goes by is a new threat for these people. Are they going to get back home from work, or will they die from some mine blast on site? The irreparable breach to Azerbaijani IDPs' right of return is both imminent and real. In your order of December 2021, the court said, I quote, "A policy of driving persons of a certain national or ethnic origin from a particular area, as well as preventing their return thereto, can implicate rights under CERD, and that such a policy can be effected through a variety of military means." End of quotation. The existence of landmines and booby traps is specifically aimed at preventing the return of Azerbaijani IDPs. The right of an individual to return to his home is a fundamental right which should not be suspended. And that is why your court must encourage Armenia to help Azerbaijan to facilitate this return. Now, what's in danger is not just the life of individuals, but also their dignity and their fundamental freedoms. Without the provisional measures requested, Armenia's actions will continue to inflict irreparable harm to Azerbaijanis seeking to return to, and to civilians working in these areas. Thus, the deployment by Armenia of landmines and booby traps in Azerbaijani territory presents a real and imminent risk of causing irreparable prejudice to those rights protected under Article 5 of the CERD. I'd also like to draw the attention of the court to the urgency of the situation, and this on account of Azerbaijan's repeated discoveries over the last months of landmines and booby traps deployed most likely in Azerbaijani territory between 2021 and 2022. These discoveries coincide, moreover, with the refusal of Armenia to take part in negotiations aimed at putting an end to these dangerous and discriminatory acts. As Azerbaijan's agent pointed out, Azerbaijan has tried on numerous occasions to initiate bilateral and multilateral negotiations with Armenia, but they were all to no avail. They started, as you can see, all of this when we met and tried to meet. And in 2022, Armenia decided without notice not to take part in discussions which would be held in Moscow. So, forced into a corner, Azerbaijan decided to turn once again to your court and to request provisional measures, absent which thousands of lives will remain threatened by Armenian mines and booby traps. For all of these reasons, a serious risk of irreparable prejudice will persist as long as Armenia will not receive the order to cease laying landmines and placing booby traps in Azerbaijan, to cease facilitating others to this end, and to cease using the Lachin corridor to transport these explosive devices. The refusal of Armenia to provide information about the location of these mines and booby traps creates a real and continuous risk to Azerbaijani civilians working or wishing to return to their homes in the region of Lachin and Kalbajar or in the other formerly occupied regions. They will continue to die. They will continue to suffer serious injury. These risks are imminent and will not cease existing unless the court hands down the measures requested. So, distinguished members of the court, this brings me to the end of my oral pleading, and the measures demanded are necessary. So it falls to me to thank the court for your kind attention, and I would like you now, Madam President, to please give the floor to Mr. Elnur Mammadov, agent of the Republic of Azerbaijan.
I thank Professor Bassand-Shazun, and I now invite the agent of Azerbaijan, His Excellency Mr. Elnur Mammadov, to address the court. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished members of the court, it is a privilege for me to address you once again and to present to you the final submissions of the Republic of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is before the court today to request urgent assistance in order to safeguard its rights and the rights of Azerbaijanis under the CERD. As has been explained by Counsel for Azerbaijan, the purpose and the effect of Armenia's laying landmines and booby traps in Azerbaijani civilian areas is to prevent Azerbaijanis from returning to the formerly occupied territories. Armenia has continued to lay mines and place booby traps after having agreed to ending hostilities and returning these areas to Azerbaijan. What other reason could Armenia have to lay in 2021 landmines deep into Azerbaijan territory? What other reason could Armenia have to place more deadly booby traps in civilian homes? I will now read out the final submissions on behalf of the Republic of Azerbaijan in English.
Of the rules of court on the basis of the facts and laws set out in the Republic of Azerbaijan's request for the indication of provisional measures of protection dated January 3rd, 2023, and for the reasons explained during these hearings, the Republic of Azerbaijan respectfully asks the court to indicate the following provisional measures. A. Armenia shall immediately take all necessary steps to enable Azerbaijan to undertake the prompt, safe, and effective demining of the towns, villages, and other areas to which Azerbaijani civilians will return in the Lachin district, Kalbajar district, and other formerly occupied districts of Azerbaijan, including by providing information about the location, quantity, type, and characteristics of landmines, booby traps, and any other explosive devices in these areas, in order to enable Azerbaijani internally displaced persons to return to their homes. And B, Armenia shall immediately cease and desist from any further efforts to plant or to sponsor or support the planting of landmines and booby traps in these areas to which Azerbaijani civilians will return in Azerbaijan's territory, including but not limited to the use of the Lachen corridor for this purpose. Madam President, honorable members of the court, I thank you for your kind attention to this urgent matter. I would also like to thank all members of the registry and the interpreters for their dedicated work throughout the hearings.
I thank the agent of Azerbaijan, whose statement brings to an end the single round of oral argument of Azerbaijan, as well as this morning's sitting. The court will meet again this afternoon at 4 p.m. to hear Armenia present its single round of oral argument. The sitting is adjourned.